Good afternoon. In 2006, investigative journalist Michael Pollan wrote the award-winning Omnivore's Dilemma, A Natural History of Four Meals. The book was on the New York Times bestseller list for 69 weeks, received a James Beard Award, and was voted one of the 10 best books of 2006. Visiting farms across the country, Pollan explored the underbelly of ecological, economic, and social issues related to agriculture. The book sparked a national dialogue on the topic, bringing into public discussion issues of farm subsidies, corn syrup, and the future of American farming. And he did this by asking a really simple question: what should we eat for dinner? The year following the book's publication, locavore was the word of the year. It was only 2 years later that Michelle Obama would plant her now iconic White House garden. In the years since 2009, cities like Seattle, Chicago, and Detroit have revised their zoning ordinances and codes to allow for bees and chickens and greenhouses. In the years since, publications like Urban Farm Online and Modern Farmer have come into existence. It's actually the work of this book that led me down the path that I'm on, of becoming an urban grower and starting this organization, Urban Roots, a journey that I'm still on, a place that I work today. And I know you're now thinking, is his last name actually Gardner? And he runs a garden. It's true. I guess maybe it was meant to be. But ultimately, what started my professional career and questions that Pollan asked about food have grown in significantly unexpected ways. What began in a dialogue about farming and the earth my relationship to has changed dramatically over time. I'm part of the millennial generation, and we've been raised in a world unlike any of our previous generations. We've had access to information around the world literally at our fingertips. It's estimated that 4 times as many women and twice as many men have college degrees as the grandparents did 50 years ago. We've grown up connected in a world of infinite amounts of knowledge literally available at our fingertips. And this connectivity has provided us benefit, opportunity, ways to learn. But it's also come at a tremendous cost. In a post-9/11 world, there have been very few simple answers. For millennials like myself or Gen Z like my daughters, to be alive is to live in a world of constant stories of suffering and devastation, a cacophony of news bites and sound clips about all the hell in the world. It's come in learning about ecological crises, like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and destruction of aquatic systems, loss of aquifers, and ozone depletion. It's come in the stories of decimation of forests and soil erosion, global climate change, and the most recent UN report that estimates we're going to lose 1 million species. It's been unprecedented stories of oppression and violence, of school shootings and genocide, of war and famine and disease throughout the world. And it's been maybe the most polarized political climate we've ever seen. Closer to home, it's been a mental health crisis that affects more than 1 in 5 of us, of increasing rates of teen suicide, anxiety, and depression. And it has been a world of atrocities in the midst of the greatest income inequality the world has ever seen. To be alive has been to receive information for which there's no way to process, information that just overwhelms. And it's interesting because Pollan asked one question: what should we eat for dinner? But one word has kind of continued on. In the deluge of crises, the word should has become an imperative. The modal verb, a receptacle for every question we've had. What should we buy? Where should we work? How should we live? How should we raise our kids? Should we have kids? In the face of unanswerable questions, what should we do? And more than even answers to questions, we've needed a path forward. My journey of trying to find that path has existed for a long time. The youngest of 5 kids, I was raised in a Pentecostal family. Some would call us fundamentalists, very deeply religious. We were all married and parents ourselves by the age of 21. Myself and my 3 sisters married when we were still teenagers. Completing a master's degree, let alone standing on the TED stage, was never the expected path. The path was being in the trades, staying close to home, having family, and being part of the community. So despite how I look, I live in a world markedly different than the one I grew up in. Despite looking and sounding like a millennial, what differentiates me from my peers is that next month my daughter will turn 14, for which many will say, "You don't look old enough to have a 14-year-old." A daily reminder of the fact that because of the underdeveloped psychological state of my youth, I became a father when I was still just a kid myself, without any answers. My family worked in the trades. We worked in construction. And construction was more than just a job. It was a way of life. It was a way of making sense in the world. After college, I ended up working in architecture, a natural extension of my upbringing. It was there that I started to uncover the metaphor of construction. Even today, multiple times I've heard bodybuilding and building relationship and building community. It's a metaphor that's infused throughout our dialogue. And we even talk about developing land when it's built. So once there's buildings on it, we talk about something being developed. The word construction comes from the 2 words commenstruere, which really just means to pile up. And in its idea, it's really beautiful. It's about providing safety, security, boundaries, ideally for living things to flourish in. Most of my summers were spent with a tool belt on, and so I'm very familiar with the world of construction. But despite this, there's a dark underbelly to the world of construction, the world of structures. We have physical structures that get to decide who gets treated like a human and who doesn't, what conditions are humane. Industrial and economic structures that incentivize decimation of people, planet, places, destroying air quality, water quality for surrounding communities and ecosystems. Economic structures that benefit the few at the detriment of the many, creating constant stress for nearly all of us in service of just a few. We have political and organizational structures that can dehumanize individuals, treating them more like machines than living, breathing things. We even have a system of agriculture working with living things that operates more out of questions of control than it does actual authentic human relationship. It doesn't take long when looking at construction to see how the power dynamics of that narrative have played out. And in my own life, though it was the dominant narrative by which I understood the world, at a certain point, it started to not make sense anymore. I started to need a different narrative, whether it was consistently struggling in my life or my work or making sense of the larger-than-life questions. I needed a different narrative. And so I started to pursue a path of education. Leaving my fundamentalist upbringing, I pursued a degree and then a graduate degree and then eventually world of academia. And it was there that I discovered the narrative of conservation. Just a few years after wearing a tool belt and expecting to spend all of my life in a small town, I was surrounded by brilliant thinkers and academics asking huge questions about the world, and I immersed myself in language of economics and politics and democracy and environmental studies, trying to make sense. But as a white, straight, able-bodied man, I felt nothing but shame. Felt like every narrative that I read somehow put individuals like me at the epicenter of all the problems in the world. And while I had left the narrative of my youth, the shame carried over. And so conservation became an identity to grab onto. It became something to make sense of the world, and so I wanted to save things. To distract from my own pain and wounds, I wanted to start saving, and saving meant anything that I could imagine. Saving the trees, saving the forests, saving the bees, saving the wetlands, saving the whales, saving the aquatic systems. Saving was an identity that could make sense of the fact that I couldn't make sense of myself. It was a way of being in the world, and I hung on white-knuckled. I wanted to save the poor babies in Africa and save the oppressed, anything to distract from the fact that I couldn't reconcile my own wounds. It was funny even when the language sounded markedly similar to the language in which I grew up, but still I needed to save things. Hiding a pretty hidden life of physical and psychological self-harm, even as an adult. Saving was an identity. But then, in the process of a divorce and loss of community and loss of family and loss of any clarity at all, saving even took a backseat. In the words of Barbara Brown Taylor, pain, though rarely welcome, will be a great teacher if you let it. And in moments of being caught in the present moment, just trying to make sense of life as a now bizarre, kind of friendless, awkward single dad, with my kids asking me questions like, what should we have for dinner? The truth is that in 2010, I started an urban farm, and in 2014, I began an urban farm, and if I'm completely honest, while I'm really proud of the work that I did it to distract from myself. And so in 2017, I was working with a number of students in their newly cultivated garden. A non-traditional high school for students ages 16 to 22. 90% of the students at this school have been dropped out or removed from their previous school for behavioral issues. There's a student-to-teacher ratio of 53 to 1 and an on-site daycare for the nearly quarter students that are parents themselves. And they just constructed on the property temporary youth homelessness housing for the many individuals that are in transient housing. Needless to say, this is not a school where students have been given an abundance of resources. We were working in their garden, and someone had donated some kale plants. And they looked pretty spindly. They were yellow and purple, showing signs of nutrient deficiency. They'd been in the cells too long, and they had root wrap. The crumb structure of the soil was kind of bad, and I told the students they were probably best destined for the compost pile. And then one of the students said, but hey, mister, because that's what you become, when you're the adult. Hey, mister, what's wrong with them? And for someone that was raised with really specific ideas about right and wrong, something broke in me. Nothing's wrong with them, I said. They're living things. They're not right or wrong or good or bad. They just haven't been given the resources that they needed. And in that moment, something broke for me. My words hit me really hard. Because in that moment, I wasn't talking to poor, black, underprivileged students. I was talking to myself. The conversation much larger than just oppression and abuse, but more universally directed at all human beings, just living things needing resources. I realized in that moment that I've been in survival all of my life. From a young sinner, terrified of angering an indignant and righteous God, to too young to be a parent, to a world saver, and even now appearing as a community leader and executive director, I've been hanging on white-knuckled, just trying to make sense of the world. I wasn't talking to those students. I was talking to myself. And while the work that I had done up until that point was around food, something happened. The idea of cultivation as an idea and a metaphor started to exist in much bigger ways, because ultimately cultivation isn't about control and it's not about saving. It's just about growth. It's not about food. It's not about food for Tony Hillary of Harlem Grown, a retired limousine driver who in 2008 started to volunteer with students at one of the lowest performing schools in the country, helping them imagine a legacy different than the one they were given. It's not about food at the Sustainability in Prisons Project, a partnership between Evergreen State College and Washington Correctional Facilities that was started when a facilities manager began a compost pile. Now today, guards and inmates together learn about beekeeping and composting and native plantscaping. And when I spoke with the program manager, she said, speaking about inmates, it gave me hope for just how terrific human beings can be. It's not about food. At Growing Home in the southeast side of Chicago, an urban farm that every year sees 60 apprentices, many of whom were formerly incarcerated and or homeless, who now receive job training and wraparound services and a living wage, including criminal record expungement and tattoo removal, all nestled in a lush haven of greenery in the southeast side of Chicago, surrounded by a concrete jungle. And at Urban Roots in Grand Rapids, Michigan, it's not about food. After doing this work for 5 years, what I can tell you is the kind of individuals our work attracts is not just the down and outers. It's all of us who are looking to be nurtured and stewarded and loved in the ways that we needed and in the ways that we didn't get. Cultivation is not about food, it's not about jobs, it's not about education, it's not about what it produces. Cultivation is about hope. It's a third way of being in the world, between the dominant stories we have of abuse and control or saviorism and rescuing. It's able to find the nexus rather than being in a world of either or. It's a world of both and. It's able to make sense of our complex journeys and provide us a way to move forward. It's a way of reconciling the most arcane of religious texts with science, demonstrating science and religion for what they actually are. Lifelong friends that get in constant fistfights as kids, but then get along really well in their old age. The students with the kale ignored everything I said. They still wanted to plant it. So we pruned it down to just a single leaf, and we double dug the soil, and we added fish emulsion and compost, and we planted it, and we mulched around it, and then we watered it, and then we let nature do what nature does. 10 weeks later, I came back to see the kale 2.5 feet tall, absolutely abundant, thriving with life. Because when given resources, life grows. It's just what life does. The metaphor of cultivation is not about what it produces. But in the face of a world of unanswerable shoulds, I don't think there's a silver bullet, a magic wand that will answer all of the questions that we've ever had. That suddenly if we plant gardens everywhere, that all of our problems will go away. Though it probably wouldn't be a bad place to start. But what I know that we need is more than answers. We need a path to move forward. And in the words of Wendell Berry, don't worry and fret about the crops. After you've done all you can do for them, let them stand in the weather all their own. The real products of a year's work are the farmer's mind and the cropland itself. The finest growth that farmland can produce is a careful farmer. Make the human race a better head. Make the world a better piece of ground. Thank you.